Hello, welcome to the podcast. We like comics because they have no bones. I'm Joe Getcho, but for this episode, you can call me Nines. People who know me well usually call me Nines. So what do you think? I mean, if you want to call me Nines, it's totally okay.
Well, I could do that. I guess my main question is, do those goggles actually help you see additional data?
They
Or is
do.
it blinding you right now? Oh, it
They allow me
does.
to see lots of data.
Okay. Well, that's good. Because hopefully you can still see our notes while we try and record this podcast. So I'm Mike White, and you can also call me Mike White. And this is a clean comic book podcast where we discuss and review comics and now manga. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter, X, and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else.
I like how you just threw that in there. X.
Yeah, you know.
Well, I'm getting some additional data here. So it looks like our records on the podcast also include a website at bonelesscomicspodcast.com that has more information about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, and a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch video episodes and find additional bonus content. While you're there, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell to get the latest updates.
And today we will be discussing the first volume of YoRHa, Pearl Harbor Descent Record, also known as YoRHa, Pearl Harbor Descent Record, a NieR Automata story, which is a manga series set before the events of NieR Automata. It is a novelization of the YoRHa stage play featuring art by Megumi Soramichi. It was published by Square Enix Manga in December 2022 and written by the game's director, Yoko Taro. And so if you are familiar with our, NieR Replicant episode or just NieR Wildstorm comic episode that we did last season, this is kind of a follow-up to it just about a year later. So
yeah, fun stuff. Well, because I can totally see with these goggles on, I'm also going to take them off because, part of my individuality is not wanting to wear this goggles. So that way I can see a lot better. So I'm going to do that.
What
So
are you going to
yes,
do without all that additional data that it's feeding your brain, though?
I'll just ask my pod back here. So the pod is got all the information,
Oh.
and I can totally ask it stuff, and it will let me know. Also, you can see that it's floating, so
I
it
can see
flies.
that. Yes.
Yeah, little trick of the green screen there. Yes.
Don't break the
So,
illusion for the people at home. It's
sorry
totally
about that.
floating.
Well, I got to describe it for the audio user people
Oh yeah,
because
that's
they
true.
can't hear it.
That's true. If you're listening at home, Joe has an actual pod behind him, and really you should just go to YouTube because there's a lot happening visually in this episode. So you'll be missing
very
out.
much. All right, so yes, let's talk about Yoko Taro very kind of briefly. I mean, we could probably talk a lot about his writing and things like that, but we'll just kind of keep it brief for the podcast so we can get to our NieR story. So he is the creative force behind the NieR video game series. Before creating NieR, he worked on the Drakengard games as director and writer, and the NieR games are sort of like loose spin-offs of the Drakengard series. So some of the plot threads and ideas and some of the bonus endings that aren't even like part of the main endings are what NieR was kind of like loosely based on. So if you're familiar with Drakengard and you played those games and you have not played NieR, you definitely should. If you've played NieR and you have not played Drakengard, I don't think you'd necessarily be missing out on a lot of backstory other than just, some kind of nostalgia for that era of gaming. But anyway, so in addition to video games and manga, because we're talking about manga today, he is also involved in related media like stage plays, concerts, and books that expand upon the world of NieR. So I actually have here NieR Automata. There's a two-part long story short and a short story long that go through the events of NieR Automata, as well as, this is only the first volume because it hasn't fully released yet, of NieR Replicant, where it's like a novelization of the events. And so it's cool because if you find some of the events confusing or it didn't make sense as you went through the game, reading it in this kind of format kind of makes more sense of things and it's easier to follow along. And they give you more hints than they do give you in the games. So it's a lot easier to kind of, keep track of what's going on. So
yeah, the game is notoriously a little bit cryptic, I think is the only thing I would add to that. So it's definitely it would definitely be good. I was actually looking at that on Amazon before we logged on just now and going, oh, that
Mm,
might be a cool thing for me to pick up, because
yeah,
I'm thinking about starting to play Automata soon, and remembering the lore that was in the Wildstorm comic and the lore that was in that game and all of that, and then kind of heading into the sequel, I was like, it might be nice to have kind of a refresher without having to, like, play through all 50 or 60 hours of the game, because it's not a narrative that's presented in like a linear format. So that definitely makes it a little bit harder to kind of wrap your head around it,
sure.
sometimes.
Well, and NieR Automata is a very, very distant future spin-off. So it's
Hmm.
not like you have to have played the previous game, really. You just need to know that there's a bunch of androids running around, and that's kind of the main bulk of our characters. There's really not a whole lot of humans, which we'll get into why that is later. It's really about the androids at this point. So not a whole lot that you have to, required reading or playing, but it definitely
Sure.
helps to kind of link everything together. So, but back to Yoko Taro. So I did have a couple things I wanted to say on him because he's one of those kind of controversial writers because his style is unique. It's often unconventional, he uses a lot of complex themes, and he has a quirky sense of humor. He tells stories that challenge the usual conventions and tropes of game storytelling, and he uses more nuanced, morally complex, and unconventionally structured narratives. So his stories sometimes can be a little hard to follow because they're
Hmm.
not following, like a traditional path that, most stories do follow. And they also tend to be a lot more pessimistic and tragic, which contrasts really starkly with, heroic optimism found in a lot of like mainstream games that we play nowadays, or even
Well,
in the past.
and specifically Japanese RPGs don't tend to
Oh,
have
absolutely. Yeah.
that tone. I think the fact that he's working in that genre makes his work very different, because they tend to be more of a, like, we need to band together, and the with our friends we can overcome anything, and that's a very like common thing in Japanese RPGs, and that's definitely not the tone of his writing. So,
Right. Yeah. So a lot of people either tend to love or hate his writing. There's
mhm,
not really a whole lot of in between. So people who kind of enjoy that more conventional storytelling find his worldview bleak and his tragic endings off-putting and wish that, there were happier resolutions. But other
mhm.
people enjoy his unconventional approach and dark philosophical themes that, challenge your typical storytelling tropes. But I think what maybe both sides could agree on is that his world building is really remarkable. You have characters that are very complex, they're emotionally layered. What you see on the surface is not what's happening on the inside, and they don't come to these 2-second realizations we've talked about before, where their
Mhm.
life's motivations and why they do things the way they do are all of a sudden like transparent and on the surface, and oh yes, I've been holding in 10 years of this and now I will let it go like it is no problem. Like, the storytelling kind of has
Yeah.
to move you from one spot to another, so characters have these realizations that they kind of just move on to very quickly. That's not what NieR is. Like,
Mhm.
his writing from Yoko Taro's writing is really a lot where characters either they don't get over something or it's a hard lesson for them to get over. And some people might find this a little too close to real life in some instances, and maybe that's why they don't like it. But at the same time, again, having these characters that are actually complex, having these, visually breathtaking scenes and
Mhm.
worlds, and they're very they're very unique. And
Mhm.
you add to that like the media of being in a video game. You've got the visuals, you've also got the music, which really complements the emotional weight and tone of what's going on in the story. So the video game really puts it together in a really good, altogether package. And a lot of the stories or the manga, kind of expand upon those worlds that you get from the video games. So that's kind of
Yeah.
a little bit about Yoko Taro.
Yeah, I could definitely agree about the world building thing. That's a very strong component of
Hmm.
his writing, and that's something that the story that we're going to get into today is largely all world building. So it's kind
Yeah.
of, that's kind of important to note before we move on to that. But the artist, I hesitate to say penciler because it just says art on the manga, is
Hmm.
Megumu Soramichi, and she is well known for her work on various Square Enix properties, the most renowned of which is NieR Automata. So there's a reason
Sure.
we're talking about this today. Other Square Enix properties she's done the art for are the Final Fantasy 15 official comic anthology, which she co-wrote, and she contributed covers for a Final Fantasy 7 remake, sort of like side story novels that give more backstory on Tifa and Aerith.
Interesting.
During her time at Square Enix, she's received multiple awards from the company, such as the 22nd Square Enix Award in 2013. I guess they didn't have a more creative name for it than the Square Enix Award. So there you go.
What should we call it? I don't know. What?
Yeah,
Just call it the Square Enix Award.
just name
It's
it
fine.
after the company,
It's fine.
She has been active as a manga artist since April of 2014. And so there are some other series out there. There was one that was particularly long running that I noticed, and then another that was actually called Zombieland that were not for Square Enix. But it seems like she's kind of been with that company at least for the last, I don't know, 5 to 6 years. So and so I actually found her official website, and using Google Translate was able to look at her blog. But it's been active since 2019, and the post on there was, "Hi, this is a place for me to put down all of my thoughts," and that was like the only post on the blog. So yeah, pretty hard to find out information on her, given that she is a Japanese based artist, and all of the bios and all of that kind of information is in Japanese. So I forgive me, guys, but I don't have like a wealth of information about her as a person, really, because that was really about all I was able to dig up were kind of like career highlights.
Sure.
I guess to talk about her art style a little bit, I would like to touch on that briefly.
Sure.
It feels pretty just stock anime to me, and I don't mean that it's necessarily bad, but it doesn't have like a distinctive style to it that feels like if you look at Yoshitaka Amano's artwork, or if you look at Akira Toriyama's artwork, it's very identifiably theirs, and hers feels just kind of like this is anime, and it just looks like, a lot of anime. I would hesitate to say it's generic, but it's perfectly serviceable for the story. And she uses the character designs of Akihiko Yoshida, who is actually the artist and character designer for the Ivalice Alliance series of games for Square Enix. So NieR shares character designer with Vagrant Story, Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy 12. That's the same artist that was behind designing those characters. So she successfully is able to kind of translate those designs into, the sequential art format. So I think in that regard, she did a really good job, because at least what I've seen of the art in NieR Automata, it looks pretty consistent with those designs and everything. So
Yeah, it sort of took me a little bit out of it when we get those like stock anime scenes where it's like you have all of these perfectly detailed and well-drawn characters from the game, and then they're either making a joke or they're upset about something, and you get the sort of typical anime trope or manga trope where like their facial features are really tiny and they have the big teardrop over their heads, and
yeah,
they're just like, "Rah, rah, 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 rah," like it looks really weird to see the characters in NieR do that, so it kind of took me out of it a little bit, but I think it fits with the tone of a typical manga, so it's not like
well,
that bad. But
I will say another thing, and this is just kind of a barrier of reading stuff like this in English, but one thing that I really noticed about the art was the sound effects that were drawn on, by the artist. They of course are in kanji, and so right next to it we have to have the sound effect written in English, so we know that it says boom or something like that. But unfortunately, because you're layering one sound effect, in one language on top of another sound effect in another language, I think that kind of makes some of the pages look cluttered. Whereas I might have preferred that they just not do like have written sound effects and just let us enjoy the story, because I think sometimes that kind of covered up the art a little bit too much for me. So
that makes sense. Yeah, so it's
yeah.
like you get a little too much going on because you have to have the additional layer of the translation. So I mean,
Yeah.
we can talk about our feelings on the actual story, but I think for the art, it didn't, it doesn't ruin it. We have a couple nitpicks here and there, but it's
Yeah.
really about the story that we're here to talk about today. So
Yeah, it's not like a component that is really going to affect my score in any way. So
sure.
yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the characters that are in our story. So the character that I'm portraying is 9S, who is in the video game, but is not in this story because it's set before the events of NieR Automata. So he wasn't around then. But we do have a infantry group of androids from YoRHa, and this is actually one of the first groups. So this is really early in the deployments by YoRHa. So we have number 2, who is she is now the leader, and she wasn't originally, but now she's been thrust into this position and she's very insecure. And then we also have number 4, who has this really spunky and outgoing personality, and they are both type A or attacker, which means they are specialized in close combat with exceptional dash abilities. So they all have like a number that's unique to them, and then they have a type that is sort of their military type, but their personalities are very different, just from the descriptions. We have one who's very insecure and one who's outgoing. So there's a lot of this kind of stuff in Yoko Taro's storytelling, where we have sort of these like stereotypes of personalities. We have the insecure person who has to be a leader. We have the spunky and outgoing, cheerful person, but he sort of mixes it up by they're both attackers. They both specialize in close combat. And so they're not the same, even though they have the same function as being attackers. So we also have number 16, who is very brash and very gruff on the outside, but deep down she cares for her squad. So she's kind of, multi-layered in that respect. She is a type G for gunner. So that means she excels at long range combat. So now we have 2 attackers and we have a gunner who's more long range. So this is kind of just an additional tidbit, but because they don't really talk about this in the manga, but if you're curious about the game, they actually combined this melee-based type A for attacker and range-based type G for gunner into an all-purpose combat unit called type B or battler. And so from the game 2B, which I have right here in my little action figure section, she is this battler type, which is a combo between attacker and gunner. And so they don't really use type A or type G in the game because that's sort of like the obsolete. But for the purposes of the manga, this is the current, where they kind of started. So just, an additional aside, if you're wondering, well, why is she 2B if there's no, B?
Well, how many years approximately take place between the manga and the start of the video game? Do you know?
I think it's like 200.
Oh, okay. This is much further out than I realized then.
Yeah. So
okay.
A lot of this is, and when we get into the story synopsis, a lot of this, like the time periods in between things, are very long. Like we're not talking, this is 200 years apart, but we're like 11,000 years into our current future. So it's like the year 11,000. So there, like Automata really pushes it as far as, how far ahead in the future we are. So we also have number 21. She's the last of the YoRHa survivors. She's very calm and very logical. She's a type S for scanner, which is a reconnaissance model with additional sensor capabilities and a comprehensive hacking suite for data aggregation, as the description goes. So the character, again, that I was talking about earlier, 9S, he is that scanner type. He's not in the manga, but just, to give you a little bit on the main characters in the game. So we also have another group of characters I want to go through really quickly, and these are also androids. Everybody in the story are androids, but these androids are from, a couple hundred years ago, that they've been stranded on Earth fighting this war that's been happening. And so they are earlier models that existed before the YoRHa military kind of came into being. So their names are more kind of human sounding names. And they also resemble flowers, which I think is very specific to this particular unit, because a lot of the resistance members, I don't think they all have flower names. It's this particular group that we're focused on. So we have Rose, who is the commander of the resistance group. We have Anemone, who is the brash and skeptical person who is thinking that, maybe these people have been sent, the YoRHa units may have been sent to spy on us.
I'd say Anemone is a little bit spiny,
Yes, a little bit. We have Dahlia, who is a fighter, and she's very loud and brash, and so she's kind of like the sort of opposite, or well, not even opposite, but like the same version of number 16, but on the side of the resistance androids. We also have Daisy, which is really fun because she's very unique to this story. She's an experimental defense unit, so she's very large with thick armor, extra memory, and 2 fusion reactors, but she has poor fuel economy, so she has to take in more. They use water for fuel, which is kind of interesting. I don't know if they mention it in the first volume, maybe it's later, but yeah, they take in water for fuel, and so she has to take in extra water because she has these 2 fusion reactors, whereas the YoRHa units actually have like an internal sort of reclamation system that they don't have to take in as much water as the resistance members do.
But
So
they have better Bussard collectors.
yeah, sure. But it's one of those things, like there's a little bit of science behind it, so it's kind of interesting, but it's not like, you know, really that well defined. But it's kind of like a fun little thing that, like, we have androids that, you know, they don't survive on oil or machine stuff, but it's water that they ingest, which is kind of cool. Our last member is Lily, who's a non-combative unit. She has sort of a traumatic past, and so Captain Rose is very protective of her, so she's kind of along with the group, but she's not much of a fighter. So those are the characters that are involved that you kind of need to know, you know, who we're talking about, because there's a lot of numbers involved, there are flower names involved, and so when we start going through the story and discussing these people, you're going to be like, wait, who is who? So you might want to replay this before you go into the story section.
Yeah, well, and I will say that the fact that the main unit of the story takes place with 2, 4, 16, and 21 helps, because if there were actually 21 distinct androids with only numerical designations that you had to memorize, it would be very difficult to follow. So as far as the story itself, it takes place in the distant future in the year 11941, so the year 11,941, before the events of the game NieR Automata. Invaders from another world have attacked without warning, unleashing a new type of threat, weapons known as machine life forms. In the face of this insurmountable threat, mankind is driven from Earth and takes refuge on the moon. So basically, mankind is using androids to fight sort of like a proxy war on Earth to take it back, but it's been going on for like hundreds of years, if not thousands. So this story centers on 12 experimental YoRHa units, which were deployed to destroy the machine server located inside Mount Kaala on Oahu Island, which will deal a massive blow to the enemy. However, they encounter heavy enemy anti-air defenses during the initial stage of the mission, resulting in the death of all but 4 squad members. And of course, the ones that survive are the ones that we mentioned already, 2 being the leader, 4 the other close combat unit, 16 the gunner, and then 21 the scanner. The remaining units then join up with members of a local resistance movement and decide to team up to continue the mission despite their initial losses. And it should be noted that those resistance characters are also androids. So there are no human characters, to my understanding, in this story. Right. Everybody is an android of some kind. The story ends on a cliffhanger where one of the members begins to succumb to a fatal logic virus sent by the machines. And so it's definitely, this is not a complete story here. This is kind of like the beginning of a much longer narrative. So yeah.
All right. Well, the story does kind of wrap up in the second volume, but then there is a third volume that's coming out, I think at the beginning of 2024. So it'd be interesting to see kind of where that goes. But we can talk about, you know, we're just going to focus on this first volume here. So anything that happens in the second volume, Mike hasn't read, so we're not going to talk about it.
Well, it's not, I don't think it's available in English yet, is it?
Or the second one is, yeah.
Oh, well, shoot, I didn't know that. Okay. I was looking on Amazon and I did not see the second one. I thought it was pre-order only, but maybe that was the third one.
The third one. Yep. All right, so check out this quick clip and we will be right back to get into our discussion.
5012 AD. The year mankind's glorious history came to a sudden and abrupt end, when the world was invaded by aliens from beyond the stars. The aliens unleashed a new breed of weapon, machine life forms that all but annihilate human civilization. The handful of survivors that remain fled from Earth, seeking refuge on the moon. 5204 AD. Humanity launched its counterattack, deploying an army of androids from a network of orbiting bases. But after more than a dozen large-scale descents upon the enemy, we still haven't managed to repel the invaders. That is why you, the YoRHa forces, exist. To break this stalemate, once and for all. You are our ultimate weapon, and you must put an end to this war.
Understood, sir.
I wish you good hunting.
Glory to mankind. Glory to mankind.
Glory to mankind.
Well, welcome back, everybody. So I guess to start off our discussion with more of like broad strokes, this is the first time that we've actually reviewed a manga. So were there any like noticeable differences versus reading Western comics?
You mean the fact that I had to start on the right end and go to the left instead of the other way around?
Well, I mean that's kind of the obvious, but I meant more like kind of like the sound effect thing that we talked about, where it was like they had to spend a little bit more real estate on the page to show us the sound effects because they had to show the Japanese and the English. And
it's definitely different in that, like, I don't know, how do you describe it? Like when you watch an anime and then you watch something else that's animated, it's very different. Like it's like anime is so stylized and it has all these tropes that it typically follows, which is very different from comics. You know, like even goofy Western comics are still not, they don't have the same level of goofiness that you can achieve in anime. Not that they're, you know, all goofy or anything, but the moments that are goofy are very, very goofy. So it's a different style and it's a different, like, I don't know. Yeah, it's just different.
Well, I was noticing there were a few panels throughout, and there was one in particular that I remember where they showed the character's expression, but then it had a little note that said gloom next to it. Like they're telling you what their emotional state is. And I'm like, well, I could infer that from the art, but I think it has a lot of things like that maybe you wouldn't see necessarily in a Western comic book, where they would just assume like, well, the reader is going to pick this up. Whereas, you know, in the sort of anime thought processes, sometimes they have sort of a shorthand to show emotions. Like you have the teardrop for like people being embarrassed, or, you know, their whole forehead turning red or something like that. You know, that all of those things are kind of like a shorthand that I think, you know, there are a lot of things that in like American animation you would look at and be like, oh, that's a callback to Bugs Bunny era or like early cartoons. And I think that anime kind of has its own shorthand because of how their animation developed. So, but yeah, manga feels like it's just different tonally, and it can be really serious, but then like jump right out of that really serious tone for a second to have a joke, but then it'll come back like nothing happened, you know. So
yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it, is that they each have their own nuances of things that they do that, you know, make up that style, like with the teardrops, or, you know, and then Western comics, you know, kind of have the same sort of things, even though you have different artists. It's more of a, I guess, a cultural thing of, you know, how the animation and the drawing, you know, evolved over so many years. And so it's like when you draw on that style, you recognize it.
I was thinking about Western animation in particular, and one of the things, like if somebody gets hit over the head and you see birds flying around them in a circle, we know that means that they've been knocked out or that they're dizzy or something like that. But that wouldn't necessarily be something you would see in Japanese animation. So that's kind of, I guess, one of our versions of that over here. Just kind of cultural differences. It was just interesting to me. But I will say the hardest thing about reading this to me was that I'm reading right to left as far as the panel composition, but English still reads left to right. So I'm constantly having to remember that the bubble on the right dialogue takes place before the one on the left, even though within that bubble, I'm reading left to right. So that was, you know, I just had to recalibrate my brain a little bit when I was trying to read it before I could kind of get in the mode where I'm like, all right, now I can enjoy the story. And because I mean, I do have some manga. I think it's all based around the Dot Hack multimedia series, or I've got one for Disgaea, and a couple of other like kind of video game related things, but that's about it. So I'm definitely not somebody that's like a manga expert, so don't, whatever rating I give this today, don't be like, it's an amazing piece of fiction within that genre and how could you rate it so low, or don't come at me like I'm not the most well read on this medium. So
Sure. Well, and this is our first time talking about a manga, right? So I think these are some of the things that we kind of need to get out there a little bit too, especially for people that maybe haven't ever read manga and you're like, I don't know what it is. All I know is it's cartoon stuff. Is it really something that, I could read and enjoy? And, you have to read it backwards. Can you actually do that? Or is it really disjointing? And, is it hard to read and it takes you out of it? And it's one of those things that, the more you do it, the more you get used to it. Your eyes kind of just naturally go to the place that you need to read. But, to your point, like, you still have to, okay, so I'm going from here to here, but now I have to read from left to right. And then I go, backwards. But again, you kind of just, you get used to it, and to the point where you don't, it's like driving a manual, right? So people are like, oh, it's so disjointed that I have to, take my foot off the gas and change gear and do all this stuff. And you're like, brr, brr. And then after a while, you're just like, I don't think about it anymore. So
yeah, that's really funny, because we were talking about that recently as far as driving a manual versus an automatic.
Yep. So what's not automatic is automata. Or automata, I've heard it pronounced as well, which sounds strange to me. So that's why I call it automata, but it kind of sounds like tomato. So maybe it's, I don't know. But anyway.
Like potatoes au gratin?
Yeah, potatoes. So what was your impression of kind of really this world and the characters and everything compared to your experience with NieR Replicant?
So it's interesting because let's go back to a year ago when we were reviewing NieR by Wildstorm. I had zero context going into that comic book. All I knew was what the comic book was presenting me. And then once we were done with the review, I went and I played the game. And I just want to put it out there now that game was like 10 out of 10, the best game that I played last year. There wasn't anything that came like remotely close. And even still this year, I've played a lot of video games. I don't think there's anything that's like touched that experience for me yet. So had I reviewed the comic knowing a lot of what I knew from the video game, I think I would have gotten more enjoyment out of it like you did. But I mean, of course, that's kind of why we did it the way we did. Right. So we could get kind of a newcomer perspective. This one, I don't feel like I'm quite as out in left field with the characters, because even though it's far in the future of NieR Replicant, the fact that I have played that game, it means that I kind of understand how Yoko Taro tells stories a little bit, and I'm kind of used to like the tone of his stories and this sort of post-apocalyptic thing. And spoilers for Replicant, but I pretty much went into this going, I know there's not going to be any humans, because the way that game ends, you've basically ended humanity. So, it is interesting to me, knowing what I know about that previous game and that previous comic, that they mention humanity at all in this, and that they're apparently on the moon. And I don't know if this is going to be explained in, the video game or like a further manga or something. Yep. But what I kept being curious about was, I was like, is humanity really up there, or are these androids just running amok and like the humans died out like a super long time ago? Because it feels kind of like that episode of Star Trek Voyager. And this is a very common like sort of sci-fi story where you have automated weapons that destroy each other and they destroy their creators or something like that. But there's a Voyager episode specifically called Prototype, where B'Elanna finds this android and she's like, oh, it's like Data, let's bring it back to life. And they find out that, oh, well, this guy is actually like fighting a centuries long war where like they've destroyed their creators, and there's just these two robot factions killing each other for eternity, basically. And so especially with them being androids and then being sent in to fight machine life forms, I was kind of getting that sort of like a sci-fi vibe. And so it's a very comfortable I don't want to use the word trope because it doesn't feel derivative of anything necessarily, but it's a very comfortable kind of like sci-fi environment for me to jump into and be like, okay, I've read stories like this before. I can kind of grab onto it. Now, as far as the characters, I guess that was a really like broad answer to your question. As far as the characters, I was super glad, like I said before, that most of them died in the intro because the first like 5 or 6 pages where they were like naming off all 21 androids and their designations, I was like, they look so similar. Like, how am I supposed to remember all these designations and like what they do? And I was like studying it and rereading it because like, all right, I'm gonna have to be able to follow these characters. And then like, 3/4 of them died right at the beginning. So I was like, okay, like I can track like 4 of them. I can remember 4 numbers.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was interesting to me from a character standpoint, I guess, that they had emotions. I wasn't certain why they would be created with emotions and not just sort of a clear directive to achieve their mission. So that was kind of fascinating to me. And let's see what else about the characters. The resistance characters that were introduced about, I think at the end of the first issue, they seemed even more human than the androids that we see in the YoRHa unit. So that again, it wasn't like a bad thing. It was just very surprising to me because I was like, oh, they're very much like emulating humans as far as like their behavior and their personalities and everything like that. But at the same time, we know that they're not.
So this is sort of the evolution of the android. The resistance members, yes, are very much pretty much like created right to be just like humanity. And so this is a change where we're introducing YoRHa, where we're creating androids that are more militaristic. I don't know why it's taken, thousands of years to get to this point, but it seems like if you're fighting a war, you're going to need some military people who are really more about fighting and less about the, personality and having to, worry about emotions and friendships and all that stuff. Like just focus on the fighting. And so that's kind of what YoRHa, that's why they have these designations, is because they're supposed to be, you are an attacker type, so you need to get in there and fight at close range. Whereas the resistance members are created more like people, like humanity, so they can kind of, their own personalities and what they decide, and they take breaks and, more like a human militia would be, where they're not quite as organized, whereas you have YoRHa, which is like a special ops unit where they're all specialized. They all have the exact role that they're supposed to do. But it's weird because why create them with emotions at all?
Well,
like
I was wondering that too.
Yeah. Like, why tell them, hey, you're a military unit, you need to suppress your emotions because emotions during a mission are forbidden. And, why not just not give them emotions? Unless either, I think 2 things. One, because creating them, maybe they didn't know how to not give them emotions, because we have so many androids that have emotions, and maybe we don't have the time to figure that out. I don't know. But the other thing is, maybe that would be like a little too cold, because we have all these androids again, and they're their own type of life form. So to create them without emotions might not be very kind. And so we just kind of do like military people have to do that, right? It's like when you are in a mission, when you are in a survival, fight to the death, you're very focused on what it is that you're doing. And then in your off hours, or when you're, you come back home, it's like now you can kind of do your own thing and not worry about what's going on in the military. So that's kind of the difference with YoRHa, I guess, is that they still have downtime where they can kind of, and you get a lot of this in the game where 9S is trying to sort of be a little bit more relaxed, and he's trying to joke around a little bit, and 2B is like, no, I'm serious, we have a mission, no emotions, focus on what we're doing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I do have a lot of questions. I'm a little bit curious if it's going to be one of those things where I just have to play the game to get the answer, but they're not a lot of the like narrative and character questions that I have are not as glaring as like what they were in that first NieR comic.
Yeah,
because
who are these people? Where does it? What are we doing?
That one basically just throws you into the world, and it's like, care about these characters, and I'm like, I don't know these characters. Whereas you play the game and then you read the comic, and you're kind of like, oh wow, I know who Grimoire Weiss is, and all these
I'm not a mere
people.
book.
So
I'm a
exactly.
tome.
Exactly. This, yeah, this didn't feel like that. Like I definitely felt more grounded with it, and any questions I had were more about where does it go from here, as opposed to is this a plot hole or did they not just write this part? And there he is. There he is.
So for anyone who goes to YouTube, the action figure I have of Kaine actually comes with Grimoire Weiss. And I think does it move? I don't want to break it, but yeah, here we go.
What is
so
the
you
name
can
of
open
that
the book.
voice actor? Because he is excellent. He did I think he did Caius Ballad.
He did.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of voices. He was actually one of the voices on Star Wars Rebels of one of the officers too.
Okay. There you go. Yeah, very, very recognizable tone. Yeah, so I guess I have a lot of questions, or not necessarily questions, but like curiosities about the some of the lore dumps that they do, like between the issues, because that's definitely a thing that, like, at the beginning of each issue they will kind of have a page where it's just like, here's some background lore, and one of them specifically stuck out to me where they said that the YoRHa cannot and will not imitate the nobility that is humanity, and that idea seems totally at odds with them having emotions and unique personalities. So like, why, if you don't want them to imitate humans, why wouldn't you make them all carbon copies of each other, I guess?
Yeah, so this is kind of like another Yoko Taro, writing thing that he does, where it's like there's a lot of ideas in here that are very philosophical in nature. And so there's a lot of, various different philosophers who have all these wild and crazy ideas that, some people may just go, well, that's totally ridiculous, or that's, where did you, pull that from, and that kind of thing. But he's taken a lot of those ideas and he's built them into this world, which in the world, it's kind of interesting because, to your question, like, well, what happened to humanity after NieR Replicant? That's something that we need to deal with in this game, because as far as we know, there wouldn't be any more humanity after that game. So what did they do? Did they survive somehow? How did they get to the moon? What happened? So that's, things like that, where it's like, you have these androids who are fighting this war with the machines, and you have humanity who's, stuck on the moon and can't really go anywhere because they'll get killed by machines, or who knows what happened to the Black Scrawl and all of that stuff, that we dealt with in Replicant. So it's kind of like our creators aren't able to help us because they're confined and they're stuck. And so now we as androids have to serve humanity by fighting this war and, again, cleansing the earth so that way it's suitable for humanity to come back and live here. Because that was the whole thing in Replicant was, it wasn't really suitable because, there was this disease rampaging the earth. Well, now instead of a disease, we have this army of machines that's coming by, and, all these weapons and all this warfare going on, that it's
but it seems like the world itself is a little more green and a little more, it seems like vegetation and things like that have started to kind of come back, at least on the planet. So it seems like as far as the environment itself, it might be more habitable, and now it's just that, like, well, alien machine life forms, I wish I could just call them robots. That's not the term they use in the story. But it's, then you start talking about robots versus androids, and like, well, which is which, and that could get confusing. I think there's even a character in the story that's like, I'm not a mere robot, I'm an android, or something like that. So I'm like, all right, hands off. But I'm really waiting for, again, probably after this story, maybe in the game, maybe in a later manga, I'm really waiting for the reveal of, like, either humanity is no longer around, or they're not as noble as we think they are. I felt like that was kind of what they were driving towards with that thought, like the nobility that is humanity. Like, that sounds really vain for them to program a directive in that, like that, into the androids. Like, well, don't be like us. Or maybe that's put there out of fear, of like, well, we don't want these things to take over, so.
Well, that's another thing that we get is the androids are imitating humanity. And so, minor spoiler for the game, but the machine life forms actually start to do that as well. And so there's this whole, like, imitating humanity, and there's all these scenes of dialogue about, you know, that because the vegetation is growing back, as you can kind of see from the thing behind me, but it's like all these ruins. So you have, you know, from 11,000 years ago, all these ruins of these great cities and all of this stuff, and they're all just like teeming with this vegetation. But as the characters go and explore it, they're like, oh, this used to be a human, you know, this used to be a shopping mall. That's what the humans called it. So they would just come out here and buy stuff. Like, what? That's a weird human thing to do. So there's a lot of discussion about humanity and what it is that they did when they were on the earth, and why did they do things that way, and what books did they read, and what sort of questions did they talk about, and, you know, what moral quandaries did they rescue with. And so there's, you get the perspective of the androids, you know, looking at humanity as like a third party. So that's kind of where that theme comes from, because it's very heavy in the game.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's very much the function of usually the AI character in a lot of other media. I mean, if we're even within the JRPG genre, if you look at Final Fantasy IX, Vivi is kind of that character that's like, he's kind of an automaton, but he's asking questions about like the nature of existence and life, and like why he's here and what he's supposed to do, and things like that. And those are normal, like, human questions to ask about your life. So it's, I think science fiction is at its best when we can kind of be like hitting a human issue, but looking at it through that sci-fi lens. So in that regard, like, this is very successful if that's what they're heading towards with all that. So, and it definitely seems to like veer. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but it definitely seems like it's veering towards looking at like some of humanity's darker tendencies too, because even if you just look at like the situation on the ground, it's like an endless war, you know. And so that, you know, is that a part of humanity that we want to imitate, is the fact that they're always fighting wars with each other, you know, that kind of thing too. So
well, and that's
I'm
what
sure
I was
plenty
gonna
of big reveals await me, you know. But...
yeah, well, of course. But that's what I was gonna say, was the you know, we have all of this, you know, sort of introspection for humanity, but it's coming from the androids in this sci-fi world, but it's got the Yoko Taro twist of it's very pessimistic and it's dark, and things don't end with happy endings, they end in tragedy. So it's like you've got that typical sci-fi story, but you've got it through this lens of things are not going to be peaceful, things are not going to resolve well. So it's a lot, you know, kind of a darker type story, but you have these moments of hope within them. You have these moments of like just trying to understand, and, you know, asking these questions of like, well, you know, who am I, and what are we supposed to be doing here, and, you know, why did humans do things that way? Was there really a point to, you know, going to a shopping mall, or was it just a waste of energy that they should have, you know, what is that what led to their downfall, you know, too many shopping malls, and just, you know, stuff like that.
That's interesting, the idea that they would be trying to understand why humanity ended too. And then that could open up a whole nother philosophical door of like, well, if they destroyed themselves, but then they made us, are we really that great either? Like, you know, that kind of I think you can go a lot of places with that, like thematically, as far as like questioning, like, where did I come from and all of that. One of the really strong parallels that I felt like was not, it's not the entire episode, but there's one scene in the Next Generation second season episode, The Measure of a Man, where Picard is talking to Guinan about what's at stake while Data's on trial. And she brings up the concept of disposable people. She's like, we could have all these disposable people out there. The Federation can just mass produce them, and they can do all these things that nobody else wants to do. And and when you're done with them, you don't need them anymore. And like, and his eyes just getting bigger while she's like describing this, like, oh, you're talking about us like creating a slave race, basically. And I was thinking about that was very much in my mind while this was going on, because I was thinking, so now humanity is at the point where war is one of those tasks that they're like, we're not going to waste our own lives in that effort, but we're going to send these other things down to do it for us. Unfortunately, those other things that we're sending down to do it for us also have thoughts and emotions and feelings, and they're very human-like in this story, so it starts to get very like morally icky when you're thinking about it, because it's like, well, they're androids, but they're actually kind of people, and they're just like forced into fighting this war. And like, I don't know, you sort of start to wonder, like, what could they be if they didn't all have to go to Earth and get destroyed, basically.
Yeah.
You know.
I'd say that's true of the machine life forms. So the aliens that you'll find
Okay.
out about in the game, they are using the machines to fight their war. Absolutely. They're
Oh,
disposable.
okay.
And even the androids are like, these machine life forms, they're just a life form. It's literally it.
Mm.
They have no emotion, they have no thoughts, they have no nothing. They're literally just programmed to kill. So they are the disposable army, the machines.
Okay.
But the androids, more like that comment about the nobility that is humanity, it sounds kind of vain, but really the androids look at themselves more like a service class, like
Okay.
servants, not slaves, but like, we want to help humanity. We like, they have a slogan that YoRHa uses, for the glory of mankind. And so it's like they're really trying to help humanity come back to the Earth so that they don't have to be, you know, quarantined basically on the moon, that they can, you know, fulfill the Earth and be on it and not have to worry about, you know, all these deadly things going on. So the androids are really kind of like our heroes of the story, and the machines are really just the disposable army that we're fighting, that the aliens are throwing at us.
Okay.
It's kind of
Well,
more like that.
I think just knowing Yoko Taro now a little bit better as a writer, I was kind of waiting for like the dark underside of whatever was going
Yeah.
on to like drop. And so that was sort of floating around in my mind, like, is this a good thing? Like, is it, you know, is it
So
bad? Like, you know,
yeah,
I
that's the funny thing is, like, you knowing that there's probably some kind of twist, and you know what you see is not necessarily what you get, especially after the
right.
last game. It's so easy to question everything. It's like that episode of IT Crowd where he's like, they're watching TV and he's like, don't spoil anything for me, and then he's like sitting there trying to guess, like, he's his cousin, he's the aunt, he's the friend, they're brothers, they're you know, just trying to guess
Yeah.
what. So I'm
Yeah.
like, I see something like a scene goes by in the game and I'm like, she's a human, she's not really an android, she actually is a descendant, she's actually this, it's humans are alive, humans are dead, humans are over here, humans this way. And it's like trying to guess what the twist is,
Yeah.
and that it takes you out of it to do that. But
It
there
it
is
does, but it's also hard to turn off when you
right.
know the work of a particular writer and you kind of expect that kind of thing from the. I mean, M.
Yeah.
Night Shyamalan is like the one where it, you know, the what a twist was kind of like his popular thing for a while, where it's like, well, you're going to the M. Night Shyamalan movie because you want to see what the twist is, you know,
Right.
that's the thing. So with
So
Yoko
Yoko's
Taro, I
not,
think it's the same, you know.
he's not quite like that, where everything has to have a
Sure.
twist, and it doesn't follow the same formula of Replicant, where, you know, you go through the whole game and you think that something is one way, and then you find out the end that it's something different, and so then you
Right.
replay the game finding out that actually it was something different than what you thought, and it's the opposite of it. It's not that same formula. Like, obviously there's stuff that happens that you're like, oh, I did not see that coming, but it's
Yes.
not the same. And I can talk about this now because it's about the game and not the manga, but
Sure.
I feel like the game didn't do quite as good of a job of kind of taking you through that. Like the first one,
Oh,
it had a lot
interesting.
of kind of confusing, you know, what does this mean and what is this? And I have to Google to figure out what's happening. But I feel like Automata had a lot more of that, where you're just like, wait, what's going on? Why do we
Oh,
care?
really?
What's happening? Like I felt more confused in that game than I did in Replicant, but
Oh,
that's
that's
a
very
whole nother
interesting.
discussion. But
Replicant banked on you reading a whole lot of text, like right
yeah,
before the final boss. I know that would kind of like, here's the exposition dump that's gonna tell you everything. But I guess we touched on the characters really briefly. I wanted to circle back a little bit and talk about two specifically, because she's interesting to me in that she is thrust into this leadership role, and it feels like maybe that's outside her programming, or, you know, I don't know, but she's very much like, I'm not ready for this. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. And she has to kind of rally these troops, which like 2 out of the 3 of them have like really strong personalities and are like unruly and hard for her to kind of get a handle on. So that was very interesting to me, seeing that sort of uncertainty in like an android. And I wondered if it was like by design that, well, she's the second in command, so maybe she's just designed to like, you know, follow orders or sort of like give the orders from one to the rest of the group or something. And now she's like put in charge and she's like, well, now I don't know what to do, you know.
Yeah, these androids are kind of more, I think, rather than like androids that we're used to in stories, they're kind of more like the emergency medical hologram on Voyager,
Yes.
where he kind of comes into being as a hologram and just like he says, well, this is my programming and my programming tells me to do this. But then, you know, it takes Kess saying, well, what do you want to do? Oh, well, I want to do this. Like he knows, you know, it's not like he is limited by his programming and he just can't do anything and that's just the end of it. Like he transcends above his programming, I think, pretty quickly. So that's kind of like with the androids, is that they don't really have programming in that they have rules that they have to follow, and their personalities are going to follow within, you know, those rules. Like it says, I can't do this, so I will not do that because that's what my programming says. They really don't have programming in that kind of, you know, typical computer sense. They have more of the artificial intelligence where it's like there is no programming. The program is whatever they make it to be. So they have a lot of free will that I think androids in typical sci-fi series don't quite have that same level.
Yeah, it's very different. All of the characters feel that way, where it's like they feel like they're acting, you know, completely independently for the most part. Particularly the resistance group, because they feel like really emotional and they're really like quick to jump to conclusions, and they're like, who are you, YoRHa guys? We're gonna shoot you, and all this, especially Captain Rose, who's just like, I've been keeping these people alive for all this time, and like, you guys aren't going to screw it up. And you know, of course, they eventually sort of form an alliance. But the interesting twist to me with the resistance people was that they're actually deserters from their army. So whatever group that sent them down like 200 years ago, like this group of androids actually decided to desert because their commanding officer like just went insane and was like, you know, brutally attacking one of their other members and all this stuff. And so they were just like, you know, screw this, we're out of here. Like they left, and they took Lily with them, who again, a really weird story choice that I was just like, why would they do this? Lily is like a lover android, or like a companion basically for
that's what it seemed like,
the commander of the unit. And I was like, why would androids need that? But
they have so much free will that I guess
I think that my own sort of bias and idea of what artificial intelligence is from other media may be kind of coloring this, instead of just coming in and taking it at face value, like, okay, well, they act like humans and they have human desires and all of that, like, because they, for the most part, they seem pretty human, even though we know that they're not. So
they are extremely human, but they're like they do have some, like they have the android stuff of like, I mean, they have android parts, so you know, they have to have like fuel, and they have this thing called a black box, and they have a fusion reactor, and you know, all of these different android things, but they are so much more sophisticated. I mean, again, it's the year 11,000, but they're so much more sophisticated than, you know, like a regular android that's built to, you know, look like a human, like not just their artificial intelligence brain, but their actual physical bodies as well. And I mean, like they pull their weapons out of like, I don't know, they never really explain. It's almost like a portal, or it's like the weapon is almost like a digital thing, and it just kind of like appears and then it disappears, and it's like floating on their back while they're. But
do you think the kind
around.
of like it being set so far in the future kind of helps that suspension of disbelief a little bit? Because it's like, well, by the time we're in the year 11,000, we probably can just materialize weapons, you know. It's
especially
Yeah.
if, for thousands of years, all you've been doing is fighting this war. You're going to invent new weapons to use in that war. And if the androids, that's their focus, is to, cleanse the earth of these machine life forms, then they're probably working on all kinds of new ideas to try to, fight them
Right.
off, which is again where YoRHa comes in, where they're like, I know, let's create like a spec ops group. Like, why did it take you this long to do that? But okay, whatever.
Right. Well, it's interesting to me too, as far as the machine life forms. You brought up that they're just
They're
throwaway soldiers
automatons.
for the aliens. Well, I didn't realize that they in and of themselves were not the aliens. Like, I assumed that they were a form of machine life that had come to conquer the earth. I didn't realize that they actually were like a servitor race of some kind for like some other entity behind them. So that makes it feel different as well, because from what I get in this story, it's kind of like the machine life forms are just, those are the aliens as far as I knew.
So that's kind of one of those things that, like, they don't really come out and explain to you right away. And so you're kind of like, you hear that there are aliens, and so you see this army and you're like, oh, they must be the aliens. But in the course of the game, they show you the actual aliens, and that, the machine life forms are just fodder, which is not really a spoiler because it's a premise of the game. So I feel, comfortable sharing that. But that's kind of just an example of, you read these stories and there's the stuff that, they're purposefully keeping from you, that they want you to discover as part of a plot twist. And then they have the stuff that, like, is so weird or foreign or just didn't make sense based on what they gave you, that you're trying to figure out. And you're like, is this the twist, or do I just not get what's happening? So there's a lot of like forums and posts where people are like, I don't understand the ending, please explain it to me. I don't understand this, please explain it to me. So it's very complex, and there's a lot of things that happen, but they don't always explain it well. And that might be on purpose, because maybe he wants you to be confused for part of the time.
You gotta sell those Ultimania books or whatever that explain all the intricacies of the storyline. I guess the main thing we really haven't talked about is kind of like the resolution of the manga. As far as our discussion, I hate, for the audience, I feel like we've been talking about things in really like broad thematic strokes, and like the sort of machinations of the science fiction world and how it works. But this, I guess the best way I can explain it is, this manga is a lot of world building and setup, and it's really focused on that. And while there are characters, they're more like sort of just broad, I don't want to say like cliched characters, but they're kind of like the stock, like, here's the one personality trait that this character has, and then here's the one that this one has. And then you see them sort of like come into conflict with each other. But the main conflict in the story is just seeing whether or not the YoRHa spec ops group are going to be able to cooperate with the resistance members. And of course, when they find out that they're deserters, that's a big problem, where they're like, well, the deserters are like, are you here to eradicate us for running away from the army? And the YoRHa are like, well, why did you run away? And of course it comes down to their commander going insane and attacking Lily, and that made them leave, which that made a lot of sense, but it was also like a very brutal sequence for them to have towards the end of the story, and I was not expecting it. So I guess just disclaimer for anybody that's going to read this, it's not aimed at like a younger audience. This is definitely something that I would, put in the kind of like older teen. I think it's funny, they have ratings on these. It says this is rated OT for older teen on the back of the manga cover. But that sequence, it's funny because I saw it out of context before I read the story, and I was like, oof, this is going to be dark. And then I read the story, and like within context, it totally made sense. And I was like, this feels like a good enough reason for those androids to like run away. And that actually was kind of them telling that story was what allowed to trust them as well, and be like, okay, we will team up with you and kind of go from here. But I didn't really understand why their commander went insane. And even more so than that, there was like the commander up on the base in space goes like totally nuts and like starts maniacally laughing at one point in this story, and I was like, what is going on? And you get like no answers for that. So
you won't until
yeah.
you are many hours into the game.
Okay.
So that's kind of like so there's what we see, what is happening. There's the, you know, true reasons why things are happening and the truth that we kind of know or that we learn through the course of events. And then there's the dark secret. So
Sure.
there's a lot of layers to this. And obviously, you know, in a manga, they don't want to spoil everything that's in the game. They kind of want to build on it. So I think that maniacal laughter was just to give you a, you know, sort of snippet of like, hey, something is not as it seems, but you'll find out, you know, that kind of thing.
Well, there was a period of time before that happened where I was actually wondering if the people on the space base were actually humans that were sending the YoRHa down, because they, again, everybody was acting so human, and I was like, well, these operators are just making decisions coldly about the androids, so they probably don't care about them. But it was made clear later on that like, no, everyone in this story is an android. So
yeah. So they in the bunker, which is a space station, basically, you have operators, and so that's another type, an android type. So they are type O for operators. So in the game, you have operator 210, and you have like a couple others. So that's another type of android. And then you have the Commander White, I think is her name, because she's like dressed in white. So they are sort of like the operations base for the YoRHa military, so they can contact them and say, okay, operator, I need information on this, or the operator will contact them and say, hey, we have a mission for you, we need you to go over here, and you know, whatever it is. So they're the ones that sent these, you know, 12 YoRHa units down to destroy this server. And what ends up happening is that they mostly get wiped out except for the survivors. And when they contact the base or the bunker to say, hey guys, so we should probably, you know, give up on this mission because there's only 4 out of 12 of us. There's no way we can do this on our own. The bunker's like, no, you are still to proceed with this mission. Team up with the local resistance. And that's kind of like sort of what happens at the beginning of the game too. Is 2B is kind of on her own, and she's like, what do I do? And eventually she's ordered to team up with the local resistance and, you know, of that time period, and sort of group up with them. So it's sort of a similar thing, but the story in the manga is like actually like super simple in that, you know, group of military operatives are sent down. They have to carry out a mission. On their way to the mission, they team up with the local forces. They go to destroy this, you know, server that's located within a mountain and blow it up. And that's really,
that's
really
pretty much the whole narrative.
But all of the talking and dialogue and relationship and everything is what takes up all the pages.
I will say I don't know if this is just like a manga thing or not, but the pacing of this is really fast. As far as how quickly everything happens, I felt like, wow, they really just throw you in and it's like we're off to the races. Like the first thing that happens is a big action sequence, and it takes up multiple pages. An action sequence that is not dissimilar to the opening of Xenosaga Episode 2, by the way, because in that we have several of their the eggs units that are like descending upon a planet, and I think Jin Uzuki is in one of them, and a bunch of them get destroyed, but like he makes it to the ground, and the mech suits even kind of like look similar, and so I was thinking about that whenever I was reading the opening of this. I was like, oh, I've seen something like this, so it's cool. I think this one definitely more than the Wildstorm comic feels like it has enough familiar elements that I can grab onto it and I can go, okay, I can figure out and piece together what's going on in this world from what they're giving me. Whereas that other one was just kind of like, I'm out of my depth, and like there's some neat little character pieces here, but they don't really amount to a whole lot because I don't know, you know, what's going on. So this one, it's interesting. This feels kind of Brandon Braga-y in that it's very like high concept sci-fi stuff, but it's not super concerned with like the character moments until like the very end. So you know, it's more about like we need to push the story forward and we need to keep everything moving. So
yeah. The first one is a really like a lot different than the second volume in that regard, because there's all the like world building, like you said, and then we get kind of the character stuff at the end, and then something starts to happen to Lily that's a cliffhanger, and then you have to switch to the second volume to find out what happens. And so what happens, not to spoil it, but is that they have to deal with that, what's going on, they have to reconcile their differences, and they have to go fight the machines to go destroy the server. So they actually go to attempt to carry out the mission, and they find out a deep secret about something that was going on that they didn't know. So that's in there. But the second volume is a lot, like there's a lot more that happens, like not necessarily like there's action in it, but there's a lot more like actual story traction that happens, actual events, rather than we're just sitting around talking for, you know, pages and pages.
This very much felt like a prologue of a story where it's like we're really introducing the world, we're really kind of getting you acquainted with the characters, but then we're gonna, you know, it's gonna continue on later and we're gonna be off to the races after this. So
and that's what the one that we reviewed before for Replicant was missing, was there was no world building, there was no, hey, this is a, you know, idea of what this game is like or what's involved in the world. It's literally just, here's a day in the life, and you're like, a day in the life of who, what are they doing? So this one took you more through it, which is cool. So I guess that kind of takes us to the end of the story discussion, unless you had anything else. But I did want to ask before we move to final thoughts about kind of like the ending that you got and everything that you've read so far. Does this seem like something that you want to continue with and find out more about, you know, this story? Or are you more just kind of like, this story's a little weird, I think I'll just play the game first before I decide if I want to continue?
Well, it's funny because I definitely want to keep reading, but the way that this ends almost makes me concerned that if I do start the game, I'm going to start to spoil story points in this, because I'm almost thinking it might read better if I finish out this manga series before I play the video game, just based on it having like a straight up cliffhanger ending. I'm like, well, is this going to be referenced at some point in the game? Are they going to like talk about story points that are going to kind of spoil where this is going moving forward? And while I think the ending to this is a little too abrupt, I mean, it just cuts off and they're like, Lily? And I'm like, what are they shocked about? What's going on? Like, it just ends. There was enough there that I was like, I would be interested to see not even so much what happens to these characters, but just like this world and like how it develops. Because like the whole, all of the lore around it is so rich and so well developed. It's kind of like how you talked about with like the Aquaman episode, how like Atlantis is kind of, it's such a fully realized like place that it's fun to like see that and like the characters inhabiting it. That's kind of how I feel about this, where it's like the setting is so unique and the world building is so good that I'm really interested just to see how all of that unfolds. So that's contrary to how I feel a lot of the time, because I'm usually like, ground me in a character story, you know, but this is, it's, you know, I think we've talked through enough of like the sci-fi things that are familiar, you know, to me or you from other things that we've seen. It's got enough of that without feeling derivative of that, I'm like, I really want to know where this goes, you know, like I'm interested. So I want to read the next one. My only sort of caveat is, do I need to do that before I play the game? Because I don't want to spoil anything in my reading experience.
So this is really a very separate kind of thing from the game. It's based in that world, but it's not tied directly into the events of what happens. Now, there is some fallout from this that we'll see in the game, but you won't really know until you get there in the game, and you'll be like, oh, okay, that's cool. So I think it's actually helpful to have this before going into the game, because it gives you sort of that like prequel information. They actually do reference these specific events, and they call it the Pearl Harbor descent record in the game, but it's a computer file that you find on a console, and it's like, hey, for additional backstory about, you know, the resistance and stuff that's happened in the past, read about this Pearl Harbor descent record. And so you get like a little bit of text where you get to kind of read the story. So it's neat to actually have read the manga, which gives you the full fleshed out story, because the text one you get in the game is very, brief and kind of like a summation of it. So
Sure.
because I played the game first and then read the manga after.
Right.
And so it was kind of cool to expand on that, because I was like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that, reference in the game. What exactly happened? And that's what led me to actually buying this in the first place, was like, this could be interesting. Let's check it out. But it's really a self-contained pocket where it doesn't really spoil anything from, going from the manga into the game. But if you have played the game, you'll pick up on some things that they did that you're like, aha, okay, that is a reference. But it's, lost on you if you haven't played the game, so it doesn't spoil it, I guess.
Right.
Is the conclusion to that rant.
Yeah. That makes sense. Oh, well, I think unless you have anything else, I'm probably ready to move to final thoughts.
All right, well, gear up your pods and put your goggles on. Let's go into final thoughts.
All right.
Comic podcast.
Homeless Comic Podcast, baby. Well, did I go first last time? I can't remember if I did or not.
You should definitely go first, because I do not want to bias your opinion on this.
Yeah. So I didn't have a numeric score in mind at all, and I really wanted to reserve judgment until after we had discussed it to be able to decide where I was going to land on it. I've been going between a 3 and a 4, and then I was thinking, maybe it's a 3.5. I enjoyed it pretty well, and I like all of the world building stuff. There wasn't a lot of character things to grasp onto. But overall it seems like it was very well done. I think it's slightly better than a 3.5. Now, I normally hate to do this because I hate what it makes me do when I'm trying to average our scores with the math. But I think it's not quite a 4 for me, but it's better than a 3.5. So I'm going to go 3.75 for this. I think that the world building was really engaging. I think that what was there of the characters was enough to kind of pique my interest, but they didn't really delve into it a whole lot. It was kind of just the one sentence explanation of like, this is who this is. But as far as like, is it a good story that's well told? Like, yeah, absolutely. It's just it's missing a couple of things that could maybe get me into it a little bit more. But overall, this is much more satisfying, and this definitely makes me want to read more than the previous NieR comic that we read. And I don't know if it's because I've now played the game in between the comic that we read and this manga, or what it is. I'm more familiar with Yoko Taro, but like all the sci-fi elements and everything really sort of pinging little memories in my mind of like different sci-fi stories that I've read or experienced was really a lot of fun for me. It was fun seeing those kind of references or homages, and it's really rare for me to read a science fiction story that feels unique, like it's not already been done, because let's face it, we've watched like 600 plus Star Trek episodes at this point. So, they've done a lot. They've covered a lot of ground. So yeah, it's not quite a 4 for me. I think what would get it there would be if it had a really strong, like, emotional character arc to sort of ground me, or somebody that I could like really care about. But it feels like we're just brushing up against the edge of that in the last like 5 pages or so. So I think 3.75, if I can say it clearly, bananas is going to be my score for this.
So I need to give this a really an off fraction decimal score as well, so that way it makes the math like really bad for you. But it's so funny because, like, when we do this where one of us has more knowledge about something we're reviewing than the other, or in this case where it's like one of us has like a lot more than the other, it's very interesting to see like where do we come out in the end of, do we like it or do we not like it, based on our biased or non-biased opinions. Like with the previous NieR comic, I don't remember what we rated it, but I know that mine was a lot higher than yours. Because
yeah, I think I was at I can look it up real quick, but I think I was at a 2.5.
That's what I was thinking.
I've actually
like
been keeping
3.
all of this in my phone just so that I can easily reference it, because let's see, let me find it. NieR For Wildstorm, oh, I actually gave it a solid 2, and you gave it a 4. So we averaged out to a 3 with that one. So I was 2 full numbers below
Yeah.
you on that one.
So that's kind of the thing, is like, something may be really good, but if you don't have the context for it, it's not really good, because you're like,
Exactly.
what is this? What?
Yeah.
I don't know what I don't realize what I have in front of me.
Mhm.
But then, if you were to rate it after playing the game, I'm sure your score would be a lot closer to the one that I gave it and
Yes.
less to your original.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think I'm actually like, this is going to be one of the instances where we're actually going to land on the same score, even
Wow.
though we're coming at it from different angles. I'm actually like 3.75 sounds perfect to me, because the whole story, if you were to take the first and second volumes together, I would have given it a solid 4. But the first volume specifically needs to be a little bit lower than the second volume, because like, it's not that the first one is bad, it's just that it's a lot of world building to get you to the point where we can actually start telling our story.
Sure.
And so for somebody who kind of already knew the world building, the first one was kind of just like, okay, yeah, let's keep going through it. I want to get to the interesting part, that
this
kind of thing.
This is a retread for you. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I had to learn about these specific characters because, they're all a part of this story. But at the same time, like, the pacing did seem a lot like slower in the aspect of we didn't cover much story ground. Whereas in the second one, we're going to cover a lot more story ground and get to sort of a resolution. And that to me was a lot more satisfying than the first volume. So I liked the second one better, but I definitely see the point of the first one. And I'm so glad that it did a much better job of explaining the world than the previous one did. Even if you hadn't played the game NieR Replicant, you would still be able to kind of pick up on sort of what's happening.
Yeah, well, it's one of those. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because world building is such a strong focus here. But they talk about in like the MCU and the DCEU and all that stuff, where with the DCEU, they're like, oh, they should have just focused more on character and less on world building. But the MCU does world building really, really well, and then they also have character stuff, at least up until Avengers Endgame. I think they balance them both really well. But I know that I have experienced the other side of this, where specifically the New 52 Justice League title did a very poor job of world building. And that was really the title where you're looking for that the most. Like, Justice League should be the book that you're reading going like, okay, this is going to establish where all these characters are in this world, and like kind of what's going on with the superhero community at large. And they throw you into a lot of stuff that feels like it's kind of already in progress. They show you the first time Batman meets Green Lantern, but I think after that, it's kind of like, it's nebulous whether or not it takes place a year before the New 52, whether or not it's like 5 years before. It's kind of confusing. And they have villains pop out of nowhere that they don't give them an origin. They're just like, well, people know who Cheetah is already, and stuff like that. And so I think having read things where the world building was not done particularly well in comics, it was really nice to read something where it's like, wow, this really feels like it's been thought out and it makes sense. And even the things that I don't know are going to be explained later, as opposed to like, well, they just threw me into something and it's like, well, figure it out. If you don't know who this is, too bad,
Yeah. Well, and that's really like makes all that more fun to get on the podcast and sort of discuss it. Is now we can sort of have more of a level playing field of like, okay, I've read and I understood most of it, and I do have a couple questions, but I'm at least involved and ingrained with what's going on, versus I have absolutely no idea where this even takes place and who these people are. So that makes it really fun to get on here and talk about and find those like personal anecdotes that you have, or you're like, oh, I remember this episode, or just to kind of talk about it and have a good time with it. I think like if I were to give our podcast a rating, it would be a solid 5 out of 5 bananas.
5 out of 5 bananas for the podcast. That's right.
Yeah, definitely a biased review, but I think it's a lot of fun to just get on here and talk about this stuff and not just read it for ourselves. And
yeah,
that's why
I totally agree. This has
people
been
to tell us on social media what you think.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This discussion in particular has been really a lot of fun, because again, now I'm coming into it with more NieR knowledge, but not as much NieR knowledge as you. But I've
Instead of
got
nearly near?
more, not nearly as much, but I've
Not
got
nearly
enough
near?
to, kind of know what's going on a little bit more. So
Yeah.
yeah, but tell us what you think of this comic by posting on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else. And be sure to use the hashtag at Boneless Comics Podcast.
That's right. So next episode, we're going to turn the tables again. And this time, Mike is going to be the expert, and I'm going to really have no idea about what we're talking about, which will be Blue Beetle Metamorphosis, published in 2011 by DC Comics, written by Tony Bedard and penciled by YoRHa. And maybe those are the correct pronunciations, and maybe they're not, and I apologize if they are not. But please let us know on social media.
We'll know before next time. Thanks,
There we
everybody,
go.
so much for listening, and we salute you.
We salute you.